slavery, and individual or collective exploitation of people throughout human history. The Kingdom of Swaziland condemns all forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. In fact, Section 3 of our National Constitution, which speaks to the protection and promotion of fundamental rights and freedoms, prohibits any form of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. We are still party to many relevant instruments, including the International Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. We also fully support the General...
Excellencies, High Commissioner Navi Pillay for Human Rights, ladies and gentlemen, 10 years ago, in adopting the Durban Declaration and Program of Action Against Racism, the international community acknowledged that no country could claim to be free of discrimination and intolerance. 10 years later, this is still the case. Certainly we have come a long way. We have seen new laws enacted, new institutions pursuing justice, new initiatives promoting dialogue, new mindsets taking hold. We are better prepared to prosecute and protect against the grave crimes such as genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and contemporary forms of slavery. Our antennae are better attuned to see the insidious forms of discrimination, the subtle face-to-face interactions, and institutionalized prejudice that can be every bit as destructive as outright aggressive behavior. We must acknowledge that intolerance has increased in many parts of the world over the past decade. The resurgence and persistence of such inhuman attitudes and detrimental practices indicate that we have not done enough to stem the tide. You have before you a global action plan that includes recommendations for combating discrimination against Africans and persons of African descent, Asians and persons of Asian descent, indigenous peoples, migrants, refugees, minorities, and the Roma, and others. Let us do more to embrace diversity and safeguard these groups' dignity. I welcome this year's observance of the International Year for People of African Descent and the many constructive initiatives it has generated. Let us stand firmly against anti-Semitism. We must oppose Islamophobia and reject discrimination against the Christians. Bias based on religious identity has no place in our world. Let us defend the rights of all without distinction of any kind, as the Universal Declaration proclaims. Neither race, color, or language, not political or other opinion, not property, birth, or other status, none of these should be a barrier to the enjoyment of rights and freedoms. Let us also stay in the vanguard against bigotry and commit to fighting discrimination based on gender and sexual orientation. Victims of prejudice must be at the center of our efforts, as the theme of this event rightly indicates. Our battle for mutual respect and understanding is no feel-good exercise. The stakes are high indeed. Ignorance and intolerance are among the root causes of conflict. Racism and discrimination are major obstacles to development. All too often, we see a vicious cycle in which discrimination leads to deprivation and poverty deepens discrimination. A marked characteristic of virtually all extremely poor communities is that they lack equal access to state institutions and services. Hard economic times such as these only exacerbate the situation. Competition for jobs and other difficulties often trigger hostilities toward migrants and minorities. Governments have to ensure that unemployment and deteriorating living standards do not provide excuses for attacks on vulnerable groups. We must resist polarizing politicians who play on people's fears and use stereotypes to gain electoral advantage. Excellencies, we are all aware that the original Durban Conference and its follow-up 2 years ago caused immense controversy. On this anniversary, let us restate some basic principles. This process is meant to further the world's essential fight against racism. We should condemn anyone who uses this platform to support that effort with inflammatory rhetoric, baseless assertions, and hateful speech. Our common commitment must be to focus on the real problems of racism and intolerance. Let us strive to ensure dignity, equality, and justice for all. Let us work hand in hand with the civil society groups that are so central to this cause. Let us work in harmony to promote harmony. Thank you.
And I now give the floor to Ms. Pillai Navanthan, High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Distinguished heads of state and government, Your Excellency Mr. Jacob Zuma, President of South Africa, Your Excellency Mr. Nazir Abdulaziz Al Nasser, President of the General Assembly, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Today we commemorate the adoption by consensus in September 2001 of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. I salute the vast majority of member states who are showing their support for this important achievement intended to combat racism and make a difference in the lives of so many victims worldwide. The lead up to this commemoration has been undoubtedly challenging, in no small part because the issues are complex and sensitive. No country can claim to be free of racism, but we must be resolute in finding the courage to unite and move ahead together. The DDPA, together with the outcome document of the 2009 Review Conference, provide a comprehensive framework to address the scourge of racism. Crucially, both documents place victims at the center of our efforts against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. They contain a genuinely universal condemnation of racism, which acknowledges the injustices of the past and forewarns against both resurgent manifestations and new forms of racism and intolerance. The DDPA lists a wide range of victims and grounds. Among the former, it speaks of the plight of minorities such as the Roma, of people of African and Asian descent, of migrants and indigenous peoples. Among the latter, it includes condemnation of stigma and discrimination on the basis of HIV/AIDS, discrimination based on descent, and the multiple forms of discrimination and exclusion faced in particular by women. In sum, the document encompasses victims, sources, causes, and forms. It deals with racism in media and new information and communication technologies, trafficking, migration, conflict, poverty, and internal displacement. It covers discrimination both in the private and the public sphere. It considers legal assistance and the provision of effective remedies for victims and those affected by racism. Another important feature of the DDPA is that it not only reminds governments of their core human rights obligations, but details further actions that states should take in collaboration with parliaments, national institutions, civil society, and other partners. They also contemplate strategies of enhanced international cooperation, which involve the United Nations and other international mechanisms. The DDPA and the outcome document of the Durban Review Conference made clear that the anti-discrimination agenda concerns and belongs to all of us, irrespective of race, color, descent, ethnic or national origin, affiliation, religion or belief. Their principles are the reliable foundations of our action, and they continue to provide firm guidance in the face of changing circumstances and new challenges. Excellencies, although 10 years ago the DDPA essentially provided a comprehensive framework to address contemporary challenges, today we must confront the regrettable gap between commitments made at that time and the concrete and effective action actually undertaken. Some states have made incremental progress in combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, largely through the enactment or amendment of constitutional protections and domestic legislation. The importance of solid legal regimes to protect rights and provide avenues for remedy and redress is indisputable. Yet, tangible progress cannot be attained without the political will to implement and enforce such laws. So let us pledge here and now to revitalize our efforts nationally, regionally, and globally to combat the scourges of racism. We can begin by showing leadership here today, by underscoring that equality and non-discrimination are fundamental principles of the international community. They give hope to victims. We must all commit to actions at all levels which address underlying and often structural causes of racism. The road to a world free from racism is not an easy one. Anti-discrimination work needs careful planning and a long-term focus. It requires commitment and persistence. In this respect, I wish to highlight the importance of developing the national action plans that the DDPA envisage with the participation of victims and affected groups. National action plans are proving an important tool to address racism at the domestic level. My office has been providing training and technical assistance in this area, and we stand ready to assist more states in this endeavor. We will also continue to serve as a forum for dialogue, exchange, and research on anti-discrimination issues, because we believe that informed, credible exchange and dialogue among states, United Nations experts, academics, parliament, civil society, and other partners on these issues can create greater understanding and build trust. As mandated by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, OHCHR will continue to support key mechanisms such as the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, the Intergovernmental Working Group on the Effective Implementation of the DDPA, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance, and the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Finally, we are determined to continue enhancing anti-discrimination efforts across the United Nations. It will be important to ally with our sister agencies to improve our system-wide coordination on anti-discrimination issues affecting women, children, indigenous peoples, migrants, trafficked persons, people living with HIV/AIDS, and others. Excellencies, I wish to conclude by noting that few people in the world today would openly deny that human beings are born with equal rights, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims. And we all agree that far too many people are still victimized because they belong to a particular group, whether national, ethnic, or religious, or defined by gender or by descent. The DDPA, through the perspective of victims, provides a comprehensive framework to translate this sentiment and this recognition to action. Looking ahead, there is much more work to be done to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. I urge everyone to summon the political will to unite on this issue of central importance in the lives of countless victims. So far, we have done too little, too slowly. We have allowed the global response to racism to be clouded by politics. We must do better. The victims of racism demand and expect this of us. Thank you, Mr. President.